Good morning YouTube! An unusual feature of this car is that it does impressions. Here's its impression of the actor James Finlayson from the Laurel and Hardy films and his trademark squint. Now this bruised droopy headlight malarkey is a common problem with the Elan. It's caused by some plastic drive bushings inside the motor here which perish with age and break up. So if we crank the motor by hand we can see that everything's going fine until it gets to about there, and then the motor starts slipping, and that's because those drive bushes have broken, so the motor's free to spin around without lifting the headlight up. And there we go, it falls back down again. The good news is that this is a really cheap and easy thing to repair once we've got the motor off. So the first thing we're going to do is take this motor off, and then we're going to replace those drive bushings. Now there are two different types of headlamp pod used on the Elan, and the pivoting mechanism is slightly different between the two of them, but the basic principle in which they operate is similar, and the motors are identical for both. Basically what happens is as the motor turns, it cranks this arm, and that arm then operates this push rod, and it's that lifts the headlamp pod. So to get this motor off, we need to disconnect the wiring at the multi-plug. We need to disconnect the motor from the push rod by undoing that nut just there. And the motor's held in by 3 bolts. Now we're in the engine bay here looking directly downwards on the motor. So the first one of them is easy to get to. You can remove that from within the engine bay. But the other two, Kate's just about to point to the captive nuts, these ones you have to get the bolt has to come out through the wheel arch after taking the wheel arch liner off. So the one is just there, Kate's pointing to it, and the other one is back there. So remove those 3 nuts and bolts and the motor comes out. So let's get the wheel arch liner off. And when you've got the wheel off, the wheel arch liner is held in by 4 very rusty looking bolts. One there, one there, one there and one there, and then there's one screw which screws on the underside into the sill just behind the front wheel there. Really, because they've had 20 years with the road grime all over them, you're going to be lucky if you get these out and be able to reuse them. Okay, and if and when they don't come undone or they just turn around and round without unscrewing, then don't waste a second in reaching for the angle grinder and showing them who's boss by grinding their heads off, because if you can get the self-tapping screw out of the back here that goes into the sill, that will be to your advantage. That will make it much easier when you come to put it back on. But the 4 bolts in the wheel arch, just grind the heads off those because the threads are quite easy to remove once you've taken the wheel arch out. There's also 2 self-tapping screws at the front which screw into the front bumper here, but again, if I were you, if they won't come out, just grind the heads off those and then just replace those with a nut and bolt when you come to put it back on. When you've got the heads ground off and the wheel arch out, then for putting the wheel arch liner back on, here is your shopping list. If you want to maintain complete originality, then you need, this is for each side, you need 2 M6 captive nuts, and they go in here and here. However, I must say, I found those a right faff to find, and even when you do find them, they're a faff to fit. So instead of using the captive nuts in there, I would, if I were you, use 2 M6 roll nuts. So these are a sort of neoprene sleeve with an M6 nut in the middle. Now you need 2 of those anyway, so that's a 1/2 inch outside diameter and an M6 thread in the middle. You need 2 of those anyway for the top 2 bolt fixings there and there. But like I say, if I were you, I would get 4 of those and then just open these 2 holes out to 12mm and use those in the front as well. So you want 4 of those. You need 4 stainless steel M6 penny washers which go on the wheel arch liner. You need 4 M6 16mm bolts, which, as you are so concerned about originality, you will also grind the heads down so they're nice and low profile like the originals were. For the self-tapping fixing at the back there that goes into the sill, that is a 1/2 inch 10 gauge self-tapping screw. And the same 2 screws were used at the front, which screw through the underside of the wheel arch liner and into the bumper there. But as I say, with those, I'm not a big fan of self-tapping screws in areas like this where you get loads of water and dirt all over them. I just think they're really hard to remove. So when I come to put those back on, I'm just going to use an M6 nut and bolt in there and a washer. And when you've got the wheel arch liner out the way, our quarry is in sight. There is the head of one of the bolts, just behind the charge cooler piping, and the other one is just there. And when you've landed your prey, mount it in a vise, and if you haven't removed it already, take a 10mm socket and remove the actuating link. Then once you've got the actuating link removed, take a 1/4 inch socket and remove the 3 bolts that hold the side casing on here, here and here. And as you take the side cover off, just make a note of the order that all the parts come off so you can put them back on in the right order. So the first thing to come off is the side cover. And underneath there is a gasket. Then, off the shaft, the first thing to come off is an O-ring. Then there is this brass collar, which goes on that way round. And then underneath that is a thrust washer. And once you've removed all those components, then you can see the nylon drive wheel and the hub shaft itself. Now, these are driven by a worm gear just in there. So as the motor turns, it turns that worm gear, and that's what's driving the nylon gear wheel. Now we need to pull out the nylon gear wheel and the complete hub assembly, and we can do that just by pulling the lot. If we maybe just get hold of this, if it hasn't been off the car before, it's going to be quite a tug, but if you just get hold of the shaft, the flats of the shaft in a vise, and give it a sharp tug, eventually the shaft and the nylon gear wheel will come out. Just be careful as you're pulling them out though, that you don't damage the teeth of the gear wheel on the teeth of the worm gear. Now I've already removed this from the motor before I was shooting this video, but just to show you again, it's going to be a lot easier the second time than it was the first. But if we just grab the flats of the shaft in a vise tightly and pull, and wiggle and pull, eventually there it does come free. And when it finally comes apart, this is probably what you'll be faced with. So inside the casing there are a couple of thrust washers. They go over the end of the shaft of the hub, which then sits in the casing like that. Then the nylon drive wheel fits over the shaft of the hub, and then these crumbs are the remains of the 3 drive bushes, which would go in here, here and here, and then fit into these lugs on the hub itself. And as you can see, they've completely disintegrated. It's amazing that the thing was working at all. Fortunately, replacements for them are easily available. Wayne at elan-m100.com sells them quite cheaply, or you can go to aftermarket suppliers like SJ Sports Cars. They'll sell you a complete kit, complete with gaskets and even the grease that you need, and some detailed instructions on how to put it back together. So we've cleaned all that filth from the bushings out of the casing and off the gear and the hub, and so all that remains is to put it back together. So start off by getting a bit of grease and putting that in the sump. And then we're going to generously lubricate the teeth of the worm gear. Just generally lubricate the inside of the casing. Then generously lubricate the teeth of the gear. And the inside of the casing. And, wait for it, generously lubricate your bush before inserting your shaft. Fa-na, fa-na. Then stick the 3 thrust washers onto the shaft of the hub with grease. So just grease the hub and the washers themselves, and that will stop them falling off when we go to put this in. And then it's a case of inserting the assembly back into the gear casing. Now this is the left-hand motor, which is harder than the right-hand one because this lip on the gear doesn't want to go underneath the teeth of the worm gear there. However, with a bit of manipulation it will go. So you're going to try and insert this at a bit of an angle and just work that plain edge underneath the teeth of the worm gear. And you need to be a bit rough with it and also a bit careful at the same time, if that makes any sense, but it will go in eventually. There you go. So it's a bit of a fiddle to get the gear and the hub back into the left-hand motor, but it does go in as you see there, and believe me, that's a lot easier than the alternative, which is separate the motor from the gearbox and then take the worm gear out and insert it that way. There's no need to do that. That's just making life hard for yourself. So with everything back in, the next thing is this upper thrust washer. Then you remember there was this brass collar, and again we'll just lubricate the shaft of that before putting it back on. And then the final thing was the O-ring. When you're happy all that's on, then new gasket, and stick your case back on. So there you go, folks. Now when you put it back on the car, just hand crank the motor to bring the actuating arm round to the right position to connect it back to your push rod, and before you know it, you'll be flashing like George Michael in a Beverly Hills public toilet. See you next time.